Hey, this is Dr. C again. So I wanted to just take 1 minute at the beginning just to acknowledge the recent passing away of Bob Abraham. Now you remember the show, Know the Facts. I had the privilege of sharing that show with him for several months, and we'll probably always remember our encounters. So just wanted to express my regret for his passing, and just wanted to let you know. Okay, I'm sure you'll all miss him. Corn. We're going to talk about corn today. Why? Well, I don't know. I get frustrated sometimes, and I said, well, let's deal with some of these typical things that we eat. I've done eggs, I've done potatoes, I've done all sorts of stuff like that. Let's do corn. So what's so wonderful about corn? Well, it's a cereal grain. It's in the grass family, and it's been around, believe it or not, it's been around for at least 10,000 years. A long time, a very long time. It had its beginning way back 10,000 years ago in Guerrero, Mexico. Probably that's where the cultivation began. And over the course of time, using breeding methods like selective breeding, in other words, taking the best of the crop and getting those, planting those, using crossbreeding. If you get a couple of varieties, you take the best of those and crossbreed them. So over the years, with these methods and all, they came up with all of the ones, at least most of the varieties that are available on the market now. So when it began, it probably began with a plant called the teosinte. This provided only between, say 5 to 10 kernels of corn. So it's just an elongated thing, and it only had 5 to 10 kernels along that cob, I guess you would call it. And so they used, back then, the natives used that shell and didn't really eat very much of the teosinte. But because it kind of tasted like a raw potato, I guess. That's, at least in the literature, that's what it seems. And so, over the course of time, they did develop several varieties. And some of these varieties immigrated to the United States. And that was first recorded at least around 4000 BC, so a long time ago. It came into the United States. Usually, they were planted, the corn was planted with other, what they call sister plants, such as winter squash, other types of squash, beans. So that variety that you could keep for a period of time and use it during the course of the severe winters and all. So it was one of the quotes, sister, end quotes, one of the sister produce, basically. So back in 1492, you remember old Christopher Columbus, when he arrived in the Caribbean, basically, they did have corn, and he brought some of the corn plants back with him to Europe and introduced it to the people in Europe. And they, in turn, kind of liked the corn and adopted it and further developed a lot of the breeding techniques and used a lot of the corn and corn products. Now, we refer to corn as, in the United States anyway, as corn. But in other countries, they may call it maize. And is there any difference? Well, the people who call it maize they distinguish between the actual kernels, what they call the corn, and the entire plant, which they call the mace. So does that make any difference? Heck no, it makes no difference whatsoever, but it's an interesting fact, basically. It's a warm climate plant, and so it's got to be at least over 50 degrees Fahrenheit in order to grow a full-fledged plant. So that's why we have our seasons, and that's why they plant the corn, and depending on the seasons, it grows best in these temperate zones in this area of the United States. And so it is a very, very widely grown plant, and a very money-making plant for many farmers. When it was first introduced in Europe, for example, there were several diseases that were present. Of course, we didn't know back then that the diseases were due to vitamin deficiency, etc. But there is a vitamin that's in corn that does treat pellagra. Now, that is a niacin deficiency, which is B3, vitamin B3, and B3 is in corn. So it was noted that it did improve people who had the disease of pellagra. We don't see pellagra nowadays, but it was something. It was something back then. It was an interesting thing back then. Some of the later stages of pellagra resulted in loss of hair, light sensitivities, and really the people who had it were occasionally accused of being vampires because of the lack of hair, the light sensitivity, so they only went out at night, that type of thing. So it does have kind of a checkered thing in its history, which I found pretty interesting. Yeah. So at any rate, we now in the United States, which is the highest producer of corn in the world, and incidentally, China is the one that buys the most from us. But the the variety of corn that's grown in the United States is mostly field corn. It's not sweet corn, although here in New England it's mostly sweet corn. But when you go to large states that grow a lot of corn, they produce mostly 90% of it is field corn, which is totally different than sweet corn. Now, field corn, much bigger cob, and it has a different starch in it. It does not have a lot of sugar in it, but it does have a lot of starch in it. Very, very firm, thicker capsules to the kernels. It's not edible by humans, really. We don't enjoy eating that particular type of corn, but it is very, very valuable on the commodity scale. And so the way they harvest it now, they use huge machines that will go down the fields, and they will harvest that field corn usually much later in the season than we would harvest sugar corn or sweet corn, what we would know as sweet corn. They wait until the stalks are practically brown and dry, because they want to dry that corn to roughly about a 15 to 20% water content in the kernels of the corn. Normally, corn has about a 70% amount of water in it. So they let it dry till it's about 15 to 20% dry, and then they harvest it. And they will use these huge machines which will take down 6 rows of these corn stalks at once. And using that the thresher-like machine, it will knock off all of the kernels of corn and isolate it. And then all of the stalks and all will get put back onto the field in the back. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't be used. They certainly can. There's a lot of fiber in those stalks, but they're not as useful as, say, the stalks of bamboo or hemp or other stalk-like plants. So they may just let the shredded up pieces of stalk sit so that it can refertilize the soil. And then they'll, after the harvest, they may run those in and let that combine with the soil so that the soil will improve based on the minerals and nutrients in the stalks themselves. So what do they use these this field corn for? Well, first of all, they can use it for feed, animal feed, and in fact, it's called distiller's grain, and it's a commodity on the commodity market, a distiller's grain, and they will sell that mashed or whatever to wherever in the world they want to buy it. So it's a great animal feed that they have, and so that's one major use. Another is that you can produce ethanol from the starch in the corn plant. And so, and that's a very complex process, but because of the quantity, a huge quantity of the starch that's produced in the United States, they can produce a lot of ethanol. And so that is the second largest, actually, use, you might say, of the corn plant. And so ethanol. And again, they sell this out on the market. You see the gasoline that you buy at the pump it says not more than 10% ethanol in it, because ethanol is a great fuel, and so it's added to the gasoline as a filler, you might say, but a very good filler, and it works very well for everybody. So that is another major use of the product, basically. It also does a lot of things for us. We can make corn oil. Corn oil itself has a good high smoke point, even higher than olive oil. Not as high as avocado oil. That's the highest smoke point, is avocado oil. But nevertheless, corn oil is a big market for it around the world, but mainly in the United States. They also make high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup. Remember the sucrose, the sugar that you have, the white sugar? That's 50% glucose, 50% fructose. The fructose is sweeter than the glucose. But the high fructose is up to 55%, and that's because of an enzymatic reaction that they use. And they can get that fructose up to 55% fructose. And again, it's very sweet. And so they use that especially in sodas and in juices, high fructose corn syrup. Now, we know that high fructose corn syrup in a small quantity probably won't hurt you. But if you're drinking a lot of soda or a lot of juices that have this high fructose corn syrup, and a lot of breads too, I should mention that breads use a lot of high fructose corn syrup. Make sure you look at that label. You don't want to using an additive amount of high fructose corn syrup when you add it all up in your diet. So you got to be careful about that. So it does produce high fructose corn syrup as well. And there's a number of different corn products, like corn starch, for example. The corn starch itself is a great thickener. I use cornstarch in cooking as well. It's a good thickener. And so we use that as a product in the United States as well. So just to get away just for a moment on the high fructose corn syrup, there are some bad sides having too much of it. And one is you can produce a fatty liver. And so I know doctors don't always tell you that that's a bad thing, but anything that is not normal to me isn't good. And so I don't want a fatty liver. So you got to be careful about that, because that can cause some inflammation in the future and can lead to some early cirrhosis. It causes obesity, makes you hungrier. That's the big problem with the high fructose corn syrup, is that it makes you hungrier. So you don't want to get overweight. Although remember, a little overweight is not bad. In fact, it's probably better than starving yourself down to what the nutritionists say you should weigh. But I'm talking now morbid obesity, way up there. And so with that comes with type 2 diabetes, increased incidence of pancreatic cancer. All these things are important points. Okay, let's get on to sweet corn. There are over 100 varieties of sweet corn on the market. Now, we are familiar mostly with the yellow corn, the white corn, and the bicolored corn. So those are the most commonly sold sweet corn that we purchase. I kind of like the yellow and white corn myself, but you know, I have had good corn in the past. And let's go through some of these varieties anyway, the major varieties of the sweet corn that are out there. Remember, the field corn, which is the majority that's grown in the United States, they call that dent corn, because as you dehydrate the corn, it dents in a little bit, and that's why they call it a dent corn. Sweet corn has, as mentioned, has a number of different varieties and a lot of different genotypes. There's the normal type of sugar, and then there's a sugar-enhanced sweet corn. So it's a little, percentage-wise, a little more of the sugar in the corn. Usually about 25% higher than the standard normal corn. There's also, you can go into the super sweet corn as well, which may be even 100% higher in sugar than the normal corn. Then there's a augmented corn, which has about 3 times as much sugar. And then finally you have these GMO varieties of corn. And what the GMO, remember, that's the genetic altered corn. The genetic altered corn. That is usually altered with what they call BT. It's a bacillus. And that particular bacillus that they use does seem to improve the sale of the corn. That particular one is supposedly, according to the FDA, nutritionally equivalent to traditional corn. But that bacillus itself produces a protein that kills a corn borer. All those worms that you see later in the season, in the corn season. If you have a BT corn, it won't do that because it's resistant. It has that protein that kills that particular worm. So the only thing about BT corn is that specifically it has to be approved for use by the FDA. That's all. Okay, so those are the varieties of general varieties of sweet corn. There's also different colors. Now, what are the difference in the colors? Is it nutritionally different? Well, most of them aren't. Most of them are pretty much nutritionally the same. You get about 96 calories in a cob of corn. It's about a 70% amount of water. You have protein in there, 3.4 grams of protein. You do get some sugars and some starch. But after you've picked the corn, that sugar within that first 24 hours begins to convert sugar to starch. So after 24 hours, there is a change, a perceptible taste change in that corn. And so usually I like to eat it that day that I get it picked. There's almost no fat in the corn, and there's a lot of fiber in the corn. And in fact, that fiber is good for you. The only caveat about the fiber, however, is that people who have diverticulosis, that is the little out pouches in the large intestine, if they eat more than, say, the equivalent of 2 cobs of corn a day, those little undigestible covers of the kernels can get impacted into those little pouches, and it can lead to diverticulitis, an inflammation of the pouches, which is not a good thing. That is chronic pain. Okay, so what are the other varieties? You can get also the bicolored corn, ambrosia, for example, which is the yellow and white. You can get different colors like the blue Hopi color. You can get the red color, the ruby queen color. You can get multicolored corn like the Indian corn. Now those are the decorative corns that you see. Usually you see that around Thanksgiving time, where you can buy little bouquets, you might say, of that decorative corn. They call it the Indian flint corn. It's not digestible corn, but it's a very nice thing to have around Thanksgiving time for decoration, basically. You also can have bantam corn. Now, when I grew up, we only had the yellow corn, and we had the bantam. Now, the best bantam is the golden bantam, which had just 8 rows of yellow corn. And it was the sweetest corn of all of the varieties back when I grew up. Golden bantam. You don't see it anymore, but it's, I guess, of historical value more than anything else. A certain number of acres of corn is set aside for popcorn. Now, popcorn, you have to grow the popcorn, a specific variety of popcorn that has a lot of starch in it. And because of also the added starch, the covering, the skin over the kernel and all, is much thicker. Now, that water that's inside, if you put the popcorn kernels into a bag, you notice the bag always says this side up. Well, what does that mean? That means that on the bottom layer, the side that's not up, on the bottom, there is a plate. And that plate is called a susceptor. It's a metal plate, and that plate in a microwave heats up hotter than the area around it. But it heats up uniformly, so all the kernels that are on that plate will heat up. The water inside that kernel then expands. Remember, there's all different varieties of water. You can have ice, you can have water, you can have steam, but as it develops steam, the pressure breaks open and pops. So that's why you get the popcorn. That's why you always put that side down. Can you pop it the other way around? Of course you can, but it's not going to pop as well because you're not going to get a uniform heat to pop them all at once. So it pops faster when you have that susceptor on the bottom. So a certain amount of corn is set aside for popcorn every year. And we eat a lot of popcorn in the United States. So as I had mentioned, we also can have a lot of products made from corn, like Tostitos, like a lot of the things we use for tacos, different types of things, and corn chips. There's all sorts of different fast foods and junk foods that you can get made out of corn. There are some disadvantages, some side effects you can get by eating too much corn. I had mentioned first the people who have diverticulosis, excessive fiber that gets into the diverticuli and can cause diverticulitis. I had mentioned the obesity. You can also get a chronic fatigue from it. Some people may even be allergic to corn, and so you have to consider that. There's a thing called phytic, P-H-Y-T-I-C, phytic acid, which in your body decreases the absorption of certain minerals like zinc and copper. So deficiencies in zinc and copper could potentially be related to the phytic acid that's in your body. You can get a lot of contaminants in the corn as well, and like fungi, and you can actually get sick from some of the fungi that can develop it. So you can develop a sensitivity to corn as well, just like you can develop gluten sensitivity to the gluten that's in the wheat as well. We also can see occasionally the waxy corn, which is what they use to produce cornstarch. High lysine corn, because pigs, for example, lack lysine. They need lysine, and so they can grow corn specifically to feed the pigs as well. And they can use some particular varieties of corn to produce corn flour. Corn flour is used to make a lot of these snack foods and all. So a whole variety of different things are made from the corn itself. So it's a very interesting topic, and you can go into all sorts of detail into each one of these different products with the advantages and disadvantages of each. Remember, most of that field corn, and that field corn is a $3.5 billion dollars a year product for the mid-United states like Nebraska, Iowa. They produce a lot of corn and many, many acres of corn. And so they depend on it for their livelihood as well. So I hope you enjoyed a little bit about some of the things that I learned, at least, about the corn. And I hope you have a nice day. It's summertime. Enjoy it, and enjoy the corn when it's available. This is Dr. C.